Welcome to the 12th District, ladies and gentlemen. We have finished our in-session shows. We finished up the session in 105 days, which was a little bit surprising, but it did get done. So we're going to move back to our regular format and talk about interesting subject matter, get a little more in depth on some of the issues you're most concerned about, and try to educate people as to what's really going on in the political world. Today, the name of the show is Tariffs and Taxes. We're going to talk about both. We're going to talk about tariffs because it's a big deal right now in the news, particularly with the Chinese situation in our agricultural-based community. This is of much interest, and there is some great historical background we're going to cover. Then we're going to talk about taxes. We'll tell you about a couple of states where there's some tax revolts going on and a big revolt that could happen right here in Washington. We'll have the details on that towards the end of the show. We'll also enumerate what all the new taxes were once they were all put on the charts. We have them all lined up for you to see just how much more you're going to pay. It looks like, are you ready? About $27 billion over the next 10 years. That's just the increases from this 105-day session. Well, it's tariffs and taxes. We'll come right back and talk about tariffs. This is the 12th District with Kerry Condata. Welcome back to the 12th District. Kerry Condata on board with you today. We're going to be talking about tariffs in just a moment. First, I want to thank all of you who have been accessing our on-demand shows. The numbers are climbing every week, and I'm glad you're getting this information. The McCleary Show is well over 500 views right now, and our budget show and review of the session show is also really ranking up the numbers, rolling up the numbers. It's great that you can access this situation any time of day, this show, I should say, and any subject matter you want to go back to, they're all there. And there are some fascinating shows, and boy, talk about great shows. We've got some good ones coming up. We're going to tell you more at the end. Let's talk about tariffs for a minute. This is really what's on the front edge of the news now because of the Chinese situation, the debate with China, and the trade policy, which is still being worked on and negotiated. But in the middle of it, there is a bit of a tariff war going on between China and the U.S., and there has been a lifelong, or I should say, a long argument about tariffs versus free trade by economists from every side of politics and all throughout the spectrum. But there was a great article, I think, that shows a little history that you need to hear about from Patrick Buchanan. Probably not one of my favorite politicians, but I think on this particular piece, he did some really good work in looking at the history. Now, right now, we are facing a bit of a tariff war with China, and there's some questions as to who actually pays. In the end, it's both consumers and the government of China, and probably to some extent the government of the U.S., but it is a voluntary tax. You don't have to buy Chinese goods, although it gets more difficult as they seem to have their fingers in just about everything. You can certainly avoid the Chinese tariffs by buying American goods, and I think that's part of the idea. That, along with lowering corporate taxes, really creates a much more level playing field for our manufacturers here in the U.S. But let's go back a bit and look at tariffs in general. Tariffs to protect manufacturers and jobs, and this is from the Buchanan article, were the United States' path to power and prosperity in the 19th and 20th centuries. That's right. Tariffs actually propelled our economy. The Tariff Act of 1789 was enacted with the declared purpose of the encouragement of new growth and protection of current manufacturers. It was the second act passed by Congress, led by James Madison, and it was crafted by Alexander Hamilton. So this goes back clear to the beginning, and this was one of the first tariff acts, which was really the only tax really the federal government had in the beginning. That's pretty much what they had. There was no income tax at that time. After the war in 1812, President Madison, backed by Henry Clay and John Calhoun, also enacted the Tariff Act of 1816 to price British textiles out of competition. The result was a lot of new American factories, new jobs, and a very robust textile market in the U.S. This particular tariff worked very well. Tariffs also financed Abraham Lincoln's war. The tariff of 1890 bears the name of Ohio Congressman and future President William McKinley, who said that a foreign manufacturer has no right to claim equality when he pays no taxes and performs no civil duties. This is a core argument of Patrick Buchanan's, that the Chinese businesses which we are purchasing from certainly help the Chinese, but do not contribute to the wealth or the infrastructure or any other part of the U.S. economy. And so there is that consideration that our businesses do pay those taxes and do contribute. The Fordney-McCumber tariff gave President Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge the revenue to offset the slashing of income taxes, which happened in the early 1920s and created the most dynamic decade of all, the Roaring Twenties. Now, this is where we hit a bit of a speed bump. There is some history that says the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, Smoot-Hawley, was the reason for the Depression in 1929 and 1930. Unfortunately, in the real history, that's not the case, because that particular act was not even put into effect until 9 months after the banks had crashed and the stock market had already collapsed. And in the end, economists discovered it was probably the Federal Reserve who was to blame for the Depression, because they did not replenish the money supply in time to stop the crash. So, in review, tariffs have been used throughout the world and certainly in this country, on and off. A tariff is a tax, but the purpose is not just to raise revenue, but to basically make the nation independent economically from others, or to protect its own production. The principle involved in tariffs is the same used by colleges and universities when they tax out-of-state students or out-of-country students differently than they do in-country students. So, free trade is a policy of fading powers, Buchanan goes on to say. I'm not sure I agree with that, but he has some pretty good examples. They began in the second half of the 19th century and watched Britain go from one of the leading economies to a failing economy about half the size of what they were when they enacted free trade. Of the nations that have risen to economic prosperity in recent centuries, that would be the British before 1850, the United States between 1789 and 1914, post-war Japan, and recently China. How many of those accomplished that gain through free trade? Not a single one. All practiced economic nationalism or protectionism. So, the bottom line is the loss of economic independence is followed by the loss of political independence, and the loss of greatness, ultimately the loss of a national identity, and the perfect example is Britain, and that's where Brexit came from. They want it back because they had it at one time, but their free trade policies didn't work out so well. Tariffs did. So an interesting article from Pat Buchanan. Again, I've been leaning towards a free trade position. I still think it has merit, but there is history to say tariffs have a place and have been effective at times. We'll see how it comes out when we get the final agreement, or if we see a final agreement with the Chinese government, and how that all comes out on the bottom line. I think it will be very interesting. All right, we're going to come back in just a few minutes. We're going to talk taxes. And a couple of states have had a little bit of a tax revolt in the last few weeks, and we may be having a large tax revolt when you see all the taxes that were levied in this session back to back and what they cost. We'll be right back with taxes on the 12th District. Well, the debate on tariffs will continue for some time, and I'm sure that we'll see some resolution of an agreement with China soon, I would hope. That is a concern for our agricultural community, as they are directly affected by those tariffs and by any agreement that comes about. Our Canadian-Mexican agreement looks very good if it can be ratified, and our European situation looks positive as well. If the Chinese agreement is made, I suspect it will be a huge boost for the U.S. economy. Let's move on to taxes, the other subject that seems to be on a lot of minds right now. And of course it would be, with $27 billion in new taxes levied on the state of Washington. That is over a 10-year period based on all the taxes that were passed in the recent 105-day session. But before we break those all down for you and tell you why there may be a way to override those, yes, there may be. Before we get there, I want to talk about a couple other states that are having some similar issues. In New Hampshire, Governor Chris Sununu wrote a huge red veto with a red pen across a bill that would implement basically an income tax on workers to pay for paid family leave. Now, we have that program here in Washington State based on a similar situation. A percentage of your pay is deducted, put into account, and then if you decide to take paid family leave, you can have up to 12 weeks with a maximum of $1,000 depending on your income. This was a very similar plan. And the governor of New Hampshire said that's an income tax. New Hampshire has been against income taxes. They've never had one, sort of like Washington. And they've always stood against that. The people of New Hampshire have turned down income taxes a number of times. So he considered that an income tax. And alongside the veto, he wrote, "No income tax, not now, not ever." Well, that's a pretty bold statement from a governor, and I'll tell you, there's some governors stepping up on a lot of issues across the United States. They're doing some pretty bold things right now, and it's nice to see, considering Congress can't get anything done. But does that sound familiar? We not only have the Paid Family Leave Act with a payroll deduction here in Washington State, but just recently introduced among the tax increases was a payroll tax for long-term care that only provides a $36,000 budget if you are not able to afford your long-term care in the end, but you could be paying this for up to 40 years, and it is a percentage of income that it will be deducted from your check soon as that program kicks in. It's the only one of its kind, but between the two, that is a de facto income tax, and we're kind of hoping that somebody will take that to court and make that point. I think it is really a backdoor attempt to frame an income tax to pay for things that could have been paid for out of the general fund. Does it sound familiar? I wrote on my notes because things do sound familiar in New Hampshire to right here in Washington State. Here's another note, a side note on the New Hampshire situation. The New Hampshire tax would have been 0.5% of your income, 0.5%. The actual cost of the program is estimated at 5 times that number, or about 2.5% of your income would have to go to pay for the tax if people utilize the program. So how can they get away with running it on 0.5? Well, the fact is, with the states that have enacted paid family leave, there has been little or no use of the program. In New Jersey, less than 1% of the people have used the paid family leave program since it was installed, even though the other 99% are certainly paying for it. And in California, who's had the paid family leave program longer than anybody, it is yet to pass 10% after 4 years in action, and it's been enacted. So the paid family leave programs they're very expensive, they are a payroll deduction, and have proven to be not very effective in terms of use across the United States. Well, let's get a little closer to home when it comes to taxes. Let's talk about Oregon. Something happened in Oregon that happened in Wisconsin a while back. It's just been reversed. In Wisconsin during the Scott Walker reign, remember, Democrats walked out and basically would not return to the legislature because they didn't like the policies that were being passed by Republicans and by Governor Scott Walker. Well, in a similar situation in Oregon State, Republican lawmakers, who are a very small minority in Oregon, walked out and left the legislature without a quorum. So they could not pass any bills. They were gone for about 4 or 5 days and finally returned on a negotiated situation. Now, what started all this? Well, it was a couple of things. Some gun control laws that Republicans didn't agree with was part of it. But the other part was a vote to enact a B&O tax. Yes, folks, there's only 5 states that have a B&O tax, and Oregon wanted to join them. That's a gross tax on receipts, and it would be on top of the state income tax and on top of the state corporate income tax. So it's another tax on business, but on the gross dollars. And of course, this is the dirty little secret that Washington State has had for years, that a B&O tax on gross dollars is a gold mine, because no matter what happens in the economy, no matter what happens with business, whether they make money or not, you're collecting a percentage on everything that flows through the economy. And frankly, there's a bit of a pyramiding as things move from level to level. You're actually paying those taxes several times as things move through the system. Well, the fact is, 3 years ago, that particular tax was put on the ballot in Oregon, and the voters across Oregon, even as liberal as it is, turned it down by 60%. That was a 60% no vote for a B&O tax on business at that time, just to fund the general fund. But this time, the lawmakers made a deal, and they pushed it through, and it's going to the governor's desk. So it looks like Oregon will have a B&O tax similar to Washington's, and on top of the taxes they already have. This is a very tough situation for business in Oregon, and of course the Republican lawmakers did not want to do that. They did manage to knock down the gun bills. The 1 or 2 gun bills that they were protesting were relieved, but in return they passed the B&O tax. Now, the question is, with Oregon recently increasing their income tax and having fairly high taxes to start with, why did they need a B&O tax? Are you ready? It won't surprise you, given our history here. It is to finance education. Because the fact is, Oregon has increased their education spending much faster than the national average, 26.5% increase in education spending versus a national average of 16.5%. So Oregon backed itself into a bit of a corner, and you can bet where a lot of those education dollars went to teachers' salaries. Very similar to what happened here in Washington State. And so they suddenly had a hole they couldn't fill and felt the B&O tax was the safest way to move forward to fund their educational programs. The walkout ended and the tax passed. We assume the governor down there will sign it. The gun legislation will have to come back next year. Well, it seems that Oregon and New Hampshire are both having some serious questions about taxes. Let's get back home and see exactly what the legislature passed. These are the bills that are actually now passed. I believe most of them are signed. Let's start at the top. Washington State, 105-day session, adding $72 million in spending for every day they were in session, $7.5 billion. And these taxes, when taken out on a 10-year run, equal $27 billion. That's just the new taxes, $27 billion. And that is not a figure that comes directly from the House, directly from the Senate. That is from OFM, so it is from the state of Washington. That is an accurate assessment. Here they are, folks. HB 1087, the new payroll tax, the one we just talked about for long-term health care, takes a percentage of your income. It will be a payroll deduction. SB 5998 is a higher REIT tax, real estate tax. Now, this is the tricky one I talked about, where they lowered the bottom one by 0.1% from $0 to $500,000 homes. They lowered it 0.1% and then doubled it above $1 million and tripled it above $1.5 million. Now, in housing, that doesn't seem to be a big deal, but think about commercial real estate. That's where it really plays, where it's going to increase cost dramatically in that area. SB 5993, a wholesale tax on fuel. Yes, there was a gas tax, but it was put on the wholesale side. That will have a 2 to 3 cent effect, at least on fuel and on other petroleum products. SB 6016, new tax on bank customers. There's actually two of them. There's a Senate bill, and HB 2167 adds a tax on banks that'll be passed down to customers. SB 5997, the border tax repeal. Now, if you come across from Oregon, you will pay the sales tax. Before, if you had Oregon ID, you didn't have to pay the sales tax, for instance, in Vancouver. Now you do. You can put in for a rebate, but most people don't. So that will be a definite tax increase, revenue increase for Washington State, but not very good for Vancouver merchants. SB 6004, tax on travel agents. This is an increased tax on the travel agents alone. That was a specific standalone tax. SB 1873, tax on vaping products, a huge tax on vape products to kind of mimic the smoking products and the marijuana products. SB 5581, additional taxes on online services. SB 2158, the B&O tax increase on 40 different types of businesses, mostly services. And last but not least, the one I'm most concerned about, and you should be too, SB 5313, much higher property taxes, both at the state and local level. Again, the 10-year estimate from the Office of Financial Management for Washington State is that is a $27 billion increase over 10 years. So, what do we do about it? Well, you could referendum most of these bills. They didn't put emergency clauses on all of them, but you could also perhaps file an initiative that would take them all out. Is that possible? We'll talk about it when we return. This is the 12th District with Kerry Condata. All right, well, before we tell you how or why there is an initiative out there that could possibly roll back those taxes, I want to thank everyone that came to the 51st State Liberty State Rally, we should call it, here at the BPOE on Chelan Avenue. It was a great turnout for a brand new group of folks. There is a new organization that has really pushed the Liberty State idea. It has some merit. The website is I believe libertystate.org. It's very easy to find if you search Liberty State, and it has a lot of information. Some of the most important questions that were asked at that meeting is it financially feasible? Yes, the latest figures show that basically Washington State, Eastern Washington, as a independent unit, produces about $10 billion in taxes. That is more than Idaho produces, and the fact is we would have a population in size similar to Idaho, a little smaller, but the same population as Idaho, and could operate on a budget similar to theirs. They do very well with their budget. It's considerably less than Washington's. It would be a little more bare bones for sure, but that's the whole idea. And $10 billion would operate the state of Liberty, or Eastern Washington, as the case may be, under the proposal. The other, of course, question is this feasible? Well, it's a very difficult process, and it's probably a long shot at best, but it is important to remember the cultural differences between the east and west side of this state and the history of those differences. We align ourselves more with Idaho and Montana and Wyoming, and always have. That is the history clear back to the beginning. And the left coast has become the furthest left of any place in the United States. So there is a huge divide between the east and west, and it must be addressed at some point. This is just one possibility worth talking about. Well, speaking of revolts and tax revolts against that far left side of the state, you know who's back at it. Tim Eyman has launched an initiative, Initiative 1648. It is a doozy. This basically puts a time limit on all new taxes, a one-year sunset on all the taxes that were enacted. And it could be on the ballot as soon as this fall. It is legit. It's been checked out by the code reviser, and essentially it's a referendum on all those bills at once by saying they all have to sunset in 1 year unless they're voted on by the people or revoted again by the legislature, which is not likely for a person to take a tax vote in a second year of a term. And so it's a pretty well thought out idea. Now the challenge is getting the signatures, about 320,000 signatures between now and July 5th. That is a tall order, but with enough people on board, it could happen. Those petitions are now available. They are available at permanentoffense.com, permanentoffense.com, or givethemnothing.com. Givethemnothing.com will transfer you over to Permanent Defense, and you can get the details and information. Now, speaking of details and information on that particular bill, next week on this show, for the entire time frame, we will have Tim Eyman live here in studio to explain this initiative, why he's launching it, maybe talk a little bit about his personal battle with the Attorney General. And also, you got to remember, $30 tabs are on the ballot. It's official, and there is no alternative at this point. It's an up or down vote. That will be on the ballot in November. I know Tim would certainly like to see this tax bill put on the ballot as well. I would tend to agree. I don't think any of those tax increases were necessary. With record revenue, record increases, and a tremendous amount of revenue available even in the rainy day fund, there was no reason to raise taxes on the people of Washington State, and certainly not business taxes, where business already pays an exceedingly large portion of the tax here in Washington. Well, there you have it. There's tariffs, taxes, and maybe Tim next week, because he's going to tell us how this new initiative could change everything and send a huge message from Eastern Washington. That's on next week's 12th District. Don't forget, you can see all these shows on demand at ncwlife.com. Check them all out. Go back and look at the McCleary show. It's very interesting. The budget show breaks out even further. And we will have more interesting shows and guests going forward with all the subject matter that's important to you. This is Kerry Condata, your recovering politician, from Studio 12 at NCW Life. We will see you next week with the Initiative King right here sitting next to me talking about his latest, Tim Eyman's on the 12th District, next week. We'll also have Matt Shea coming up to talk more about that 51st Liberty State concept in the next few weeks. Lots to come. Stay tuned. We'll see you soon.